Okay, so we're recording. Great. Okay, thanks for coming along this morning. We would like to get started, and we're hoping to cover pretty much everything that you'll need to be able to start off and install, set up the prerequisites, and then configure in general the Sage ERP X3 connector for Sage CRM. So this is a product that has been branded for Sage earlier on this year, and it's based on a product that we have had for a number of years actually, called the Enbu Webservice Framework. What you're about to see this morning is exact same software, except it's been rebranded for Sage, and it is a specific flavor, if you want to call, which is specific for X3. So what you will get out of the box will include lots of functionality prepackaged around the accounts, quotes, and orders. And this is all going to be in real time, being able to drill down on that data on a read-write basis. And you'll see, most importantly, is that it's very, very configurable, extendable, and even in some areas a lot of open source, which allows you to really modify it to the nth degree in terms of what you want to do with it. So what is it? I suppose let's start from scratch. Ultimately, it is an integration solution which sits between Sage CRM and Sage ERP X3. It utilizes the basic standard built-in Webservice API that comes with Sage ERP X3. This Webservice API has been available since version 5 through the various versions up to version 6.5, which is the flagship version that we are largely testing, promoting, and releasing on. Although we have tested and it seems to run fine on previous versions also. What's important is that Webservice API is a supported and well-defined API, which will also run in the future versions also. So that's quite important, that it is future-proofed, and it will continue to be used in version 7 of Sage ERP X3. That API is has a full CRUD ability, and it is in real-time basis, but allows you to pretty much connect to any object you want to within ERP. We'll explain more on the technical front in a moment. So in general, it's fully customizable, fully real-time. Potentially, it can be used in terms of this integration to address needs of budget as well. If you need a flavor of ERP licensing and CRM licensing, it means you do not necessarily have to have both correlated. So in other words, you could have 50 CRM users and 20 ERP users, and through the integration, you could still provide functionality of ERP data to your additional CRM users. That's a possibility that you may need to use on a more commercial front as you go. Okay, so we're going to dwell on this page quite a bit because this is the essence of really how the whole thing is set up, and it will give you a better idea of what to look for, what to be aware of, and how to maintain the system and diagnose issues as they may or may not occur. So on the left-hand side, we have ERP X3 connecting with Sage CRM using the X3 connector. And in general, that point-to-point connection is illustrated and broken out on the right-hand side to explain how the whole thing hangs together. So we take the top right square, which is X3, breaking it down into its basics, reading it from right to left, is ultimately X3 in terms of data, is obviously running on a database, which has multiple tables, lots and lots of links and subtables and relationship tables and link tables and all that kind of thing, but ultimately the database. And if we take a very simple example, let's say we use the customer concept, there is a BP customer table in the X3 database. Now, what we also know is, though, in X3, is that we don't have direct access to these databases, or we prefer not to have them. And X3 controls this point by creating a full object interface-based GUI, and all access to the data are through these objects. And these objects have their own validation and calculations and required fields and default values and all of the stuff that makes up intelligent interface logic. So rather than dealing with a BP customer table, we start talking about objects similar to, for example, the BPC object. And these are all built in, part of the standard, so we're not talking about anything new here. This is all existing kind of setup within X3. So now we're talking about the BPC object. The BPC object gives you access to that BP customer and ultimately has all that logic that we just talked about, validation, default, and so on. So now we have all these objects. The next and the more interesting area now going from right to left is that you can now web service enable these objects or make these objects accessible through web services. And this is a very straightforward exercise of creating what we might call a web service definition. So if we carry on from the idea of a BPC object, we can then expose it to web services, creating a web service definition. And in this case, I think we have it called, in the example, a WS customer. So a WS customer is a simple, straightforward definition that points to the BPC object. And in turn, the BPC objects give you access to all the underlying data within the customer tables of the database. But it's kept very straightforward on the fact that it is now simply a web service definition called WS customer. It can be called whatever you like, of course, but we just have the convention here of calling it WS customer. And that WS customer definition is now, once it's published, is available through this generic X3 web service, which is available as the green square around the overall view of the API. Okay, so a lot of what we just discussed is standard, configurable, and built into X3 options. And in fact, web services is available as standard with X3, and it's just a case of turning it on if it hasn't already been turned on, and configuring it and scaling it up if you want to do high-scale deployments, etc., etc. But there's nothing in here that we've spoken about that isn't standard and built in and available. Okay, so now we move into really the intelligence of what's available now through this X3 connector. As part of the framework, we have what we call the web service gateway. And this is an autonomous .NET-based web service that we have developed, which can be deployed on any server you choose. It doesn't really matter. Again, that's a deployment option. It by default actually gets installed on the CRM server. But in fact, it can be on any server you so choose for scaling and load balancing. But ultimately, that gateway is a built-in logic, and it includes in it a series of connectors. And in this version of the Sage ERP X3 connector, there's a built-in X3 connector already supplied, which is a transfer or a transformation connector, which basically takes the XML, which is proprietary for X3, and sends and receives that XML and transforms it into something more readable for CRM, because below the X3 connector, we have a CRM connector. And ultimately, the gateway, if you want to have a basic level of feeling for it, is that it is a transformation service. It is able to send and receive XML in various formats, or not even just XML. It can run proprietary connectors to do all sorts of other things. But that's not the scope of today. Today is specifically about the X3 connector working with the CRM connector so that it can all work on a point-to-point basis and transform the XML messaging from one to the other. So as you have this X3 XML coming down from X3 into the gateway can transform that X3 XML and then substitute and transform it into something readable to CRM. Now, in our framework, we use an industry standard called ADO XML or ADO schema, and this comes down into CRM through to our libraries that we have built into the framework in Sage CRM. And ultimately, this XML is something that we expect to receive from any connector within the gateway. Once this ADO XML comes down, we now have a bunch of libraries and interfaces and transforms that allow us to change that in real time into ultimately a record object. And that record object is now something that standard CRM knows how to deal with. Now we are into a very interesting area which allows us to have full administrative capacity to create interfaces in CRM. So in turn, CRM has screens and lists and the standard types of interface objects that makes up Sage CRM. Anyone developing or configuring in Sage CRM knows these objects well. They are screen objects with lots of P-level scripts and defaults and ordering and behaviors of how they behave, and also the list objects have the number of columns, what the order by options are, how many record displays, and these objects and these interfaces can now render and show X3 data because the X3 data has been transformed into a readable format that CRM can use. And this is the basis of the architecture that we have used in the Sage ERP X3 connector. It's very, very generic, and it allows for a high level of configuration and extendability. So you'll see as part of setup, and we'll talk about how to set that up and all, and the software and the connection points. You'll see that all we have done is implemented prepackaged functionality around the accounts and the quotes and orders, merely as a demonstration and implementation of exactly those pieces of data. But they do not do anything that is functionally specific for those areas. They are leveraging the architecture that you see here on the page. So if you want to move it on into suppliers or work orders or projects or RMAs or service level jobs, whatever the extra things that you may want to do on an X3 integration front, you can do exactly what we have done and extend the list of objects that are enabled and turned on within the system for interface behaviors. So it's quite an important page. It explains the basics of what we really have done to enable this integration, and it really does open it up for all sorts of possibilities. So some basic points. We are, because the X3 connector is based on what we call the Webservice Framework that's been around for a number of years. It's not CRM version specific. It does go back to the likes of 6.2, 6.0, and so on. Really, the reality is that a lot of the flagship versions and testing have been around 7.1 and 7.2, working with X3 6.5. But again, we are not specifically saying that that's the only compatibility. We have run various versions over testing, and on X3 it runs all the way back to version 5. On CRM we've run it back to 7.0, and I think we've had some 6.2 as well. But ultimately, I would say 7.0, 7.1, 7.2 are the main areas that we spend time on, and 5, 6, and 6.5 are the versions we spend time on with X3 as well. But we will support those versions and continue to do so if there's any issues. It is a real-time connector, as we've already discussed. And an important point just now to kind of, understand is that now what you'll see is Sage CRM intrinsic web pages being generated with X3 data, which means that it's built into Sage CRM in terms of its designs, and that means you start getting some interesting advantages. Sage CRM, as we know, is now multi-browser compatible and also multi-device compatible. So essentially, through this use of Sage CRM and through the integrator, you can now start talking about things like rapid order entry for X3 on tablets, rapid order entry potentially even on mobiles. Because of the fact that Sage CRM offers itself on these different devices, we can make that available through these different mediums, and it really does start to open up the potential of what you can do on the promotion of X3 and CRM integration. And again, to re-emphasize always, it is fully customizable, extendable, and something that we really want to make sure people are aware of, because that's really what you would probably want to do on a given X3 CRM project, is move it on from the level that we have delivered it on. Okay. So in terms of other things that come through because of the way that we have actually developed this, some other things that may not be obvious straight away. Firstly is that those X3 objects that we talked about have all that validation rules and defaults and required fields and all that calculation, roll-up calculations and totals. All of these are things that we inherit as behaviors on the web service objects. And that's quite huge. It's a big advantage because you will not create any data loopholes or data backdoors in being able. You must follow the validation rules are built in, and the system will inherently support those validation rules, and we don't need to reinvent them. So it's really what the integration connector reports back to us, rather than us trying to reinvent those rules. This really means that at the end of the day, you can really create these objects and expect to follow the same rules as you go. Other things to be aware of is that this connector can upgrade to the full Webservice Framework, which means that we will just open up the gateway to allow you to introduce other third-party applications into the system. So we're nearly saying we're advocating that this framework allows to have a multi-system, multi-tiered integration solution, and not just for Sage ERP X3 and Sage CRM, but for any other third-party systems you may want to include in particular projects. And then one other point on the slide I suppose worthwhile pointing out is that there really is no X3 development requirements. It is very much a configuration point to be able to make sure you turn on the objects, and then really it's all about data. What data do you need? What data do you not need? And definitely an understanding of X3 data is definitely needed, but otherwise it's not a development exercise. Now I would say something to be aware of is that what you'll find as you go through the integration is that you'll very quickly have things up and running, but you will have to deal with your X3 data in a considerated way. We've noticed, for example, on the demo databases, there's quite a lot of accounts that are not really set up correctly yet for things like shipment sites. First, will allow easy quote and order generation. So you will see those issues come through, and you have to deal with them as an X3 specific rather than an integration point. But that nonetheless really still means you just need to have X3 configuration understandings if and when you need to change how X3 behaves. But the integration itself is up and running very quickly and does not require any X3 development. Okay, so I'm just going to stop at that point and just check our chat line, make sure there's no questions so far. We're all good so far. I'll keep on going, and we'll move on to actual software. So first things first, let's get this is the practical side of things now. We're talking about installation steps. First things first is you obviously have to get your hands on the product. You will. There are two varieties of product that will support the same functionality. One is called the Enbu Webservice Framework 2.1, which is not the version of the software that you guys need to concern yourself with. You are more interested in the Sage branded version, which is the Sage CRM X3 Connector Executable. That is the version that the Sage OpCo will provide to you. It's something that we're providing to Sage, and we will continue the maintenance and version upgrades through Sage and on to the partner base. So just to be aware, that is the actual executable you should be working with, and it's available now through Sage as we go. Once it's installed, it's a very simple point-and-click procedure, but what I would say is be aware of the user guide and get your hands on that user guide as soon as you can. Now, it does come available, obviously, once it's installed, the product, but I think it makes sense to have it, read it, and understand it as part of the installation steps as well. The installation is all well documented. It will show you the steps on actually running the installer. You run it against the CRM server, obviously. Point and click, wizard concept, and just one area that you may get this question about virtual directories. It's purely a yes/no answer, and you basically say yes. And if you're reinstalling the connector for a second time, this often comes up as a prompt just to reinstall the virtual directory, and the answer is yes, ultimately, that you go. And there really isn't much more. It's very similar to a Sage CRM install, and you will have the user guide available anyway once you install it as you go. Okay, now, so once this has been installed, you will get to this point, which is that you will see within your admin section, you will have an option. Once I log in, let's get that started. Once you have logged in, you will have a new function or a new area within the admin area. So again, you may have a previous version of the Enbu Webservice Framework will have slightly different icons, but if you're starting this from the first time, you should have a Sage CRM integration to Sage ERP X3. And that is the new button that you should have available within the admin section. And this is what it should look like. And you know that you've gotten to step 1 or stage 1 in installing the product. Okay, so we're going to take it nice and slow and make sure that we hit all of the various steps that you need to get things up and running. First of all, you can check the gateway service itself. This is pretty much a given, and if it doesn't come up, then there's issues, but it should be up and running. This is actually what we would call the gateway service. There's not much more to worry about. Once you know it's up and running, it's available. That's your kind of step 1 sanity check. The next thing really is to make the basic web service connection to X3. So what's important on that basis is that you actually are able to make that ultimate connection. So how do you know what that connection is? Well, first things first is that you should understand the name of the server of the X3 server, and you should be looking for a web service URL. Now, this is something that you should be just aware of, or one of your X3 configurators should be aware of, is that there is a web service available for any X3 server. And we have a server running at the moment. This is just called X3, STD, etc. And then everything else in here is standard that comes with the URL. And if you simply plug that up on a web browser, check, and you should get some confirmation in here that yes, we're up and running and we have that web service URL. Okay, the second thing you will be need to confirm is that if that's available, you should have a very, very useful utility called the X3 Webservice Tester. And that's available using the same server name / root. And when you log into it, you should have something similar to this interface. This is your friend. This piece of software will really help you deal with any X3 specific issues around the system. And it's something that you should get used to using, and we will use it in examples as we go forward here. One of the first areas to be aware of is the idea of making the connection or logging into the web service. And that will be under the Webservice Tester and the Webservice Context Creation. Now, these are parameters that you should be aware of in your X3 console within X3 itself. And you should be given these parameters as part of the initial setup, and you should be aware of what these values are in this exercise. So in our exercise, a tool or a web service group is set up called WSF. It could be called whatever. It could be CRM, it could be X3 CRM, it could be demo. You need to get that information from your X3 configuration person. I also know that we have admin as a user login that we can use, no password, and there's a language that is set for every tool. And I can save that context, and I know that that has worked, and it's given me context. Now, those steps are essential because you will now need to understand and replicate that information in your gateway. So first things first is your file system. And when you install CRM, you will have something similar to a CRM install routing through the custom page as Enbu Framework Server Gateway. This location is the location of your gateway on the file server system, on the assumption it has not been moved from the CRM server. The only area here to really concern yourself with is the web.config. And that is a standard configuration file that comes with all web services. And when you open up that web.config, you will see a series of data in here. Now, there's not really much to look at in here. A lot of it you can leave to itself. The only areas that you really need to concern yourself with is the X3 specific areas. So down here, around line 26, 25, you'll see similar settings that we just used on the X3 Webservice Tester that must be filled in here. So this is our X3 tool, the second my example, the language ENG, which is again the value that was on the tester, and these are the admin no password. And the only other area then to concern yourself with is down further, is you will see a URL which is for the X3 web service. And again, this should be changed to be the name of the server, for example, that you're using. The rest of it should be pretty standard. And if you have each of these settings done, so that's Number one, the X3 web service, and number two, the configuration parameters to log into the service. That is as much as you need to worry about within the web.config. Okay, so that step has got you to the point whereby you should have a connection to Sage CRM, to X3. But the next part is then the final part that really gets everything up and running and made. By the way, let's go back to our user guide just to explain. Everything is all in the user guide, so you can reread this at any stage. You'll see here from page 11 onwards. Here's the examples of setting up the configuration items, as well as setting up the X3 web service URL. So you can see the examples in there. And now we're moving on to, after you've done the URL and checked the service, done each of these things, we now want to set up the basic X3 connections. So this is the final piece that really gets you up and running and started. So in this example, you need to go to the X3 client. And this is the only time you really need to do this, so that you can actually set up that basic level of turning on these web service definitions within X3. So in this example, you go to the X3 client and you go to the web services area, which is under development, processing dictionary, processing, and web services. And you'll have something similar to the screenshot we've seen here. And in the example you'll have a whole series of other web service objects. But what we want to do is create new ones. So we have 7 basic web service definitions that we need to set up. And this is just because we have pre-packaged this functionality within the product. And by setting these up, you're enabling the functionality to run correctly. So when you go into this, you literally will see how simple it is. If you go File, New, it will ask you a name for the publication or the web service definition. It'll always be of type object. And then you point this web service publication name to the name of the object that you need. And in this case, that will be the object, the X3 object. So let me bring this up a little bit, and you can see that we have our WS customer we put in, which is a type object, and it's pointing to BPC. And when you put those arguments in, you simply run the create option, and once that's been created, you simply publish the object. Now, you will notice you've published it because when it comes back, you will have settings and information which shows you that it was published on, by, and it basically comes up with the name of the program, which is the stub that X3 generates as part of the connection. So this literally takes about 10 seconds per object. It really is very straightforward, and it's a little bit cumbersome to open up an X3 client in this session. If anybody needs to see a demonstration of that, we can do that after the session, if people would like to see that. But it's very, very straightforward to turn on these objects as you go. Okay. Now, on the assumption that you created each of these objects as we have listed here, what you should notice is we have a WS Connections tab in our own integration option, and these are already pre-packaged, ready and waiting to be used. And so this is the CRM side that said, right, I'm expecting these objects to be in place on the X3 side. And we've already pre-packaged these, so you don't have to do much with them. But if you take each example, and we'll explain what is a connection in here. So first things first is the name of the gateway that we call here. So in this case, we have a X3 WS customer. Now, to break down what that means is the prefix X3 tells the gateway that this is an X3 connector function that we're calling. Just don't forget the framework can run on multiple systems, and we use a prefix in this case to explain to the gateway, yeah, it's an X3 function. The WS customer piece is the name of the web service object that we have just defined on the X3 side. So by definition, this method says, please go to X3 and please call my WS customer object. The metadata table is the name of the CRM entity that we are about to create, because it actually creates a virtual entity which illustrates and shows all of the data that this web service definition can provide. And then you have descriptions and various things that are useful for documentation, but most importantly is the test parameters. Now this comes shipped with test parameters which would most likely not be applicable for your database. So the very, very first thing you should do is change this to be an asterisk. And that basically means the wildcard. And it says, right, before I specify a test parameter, I want to get some data back that gives me an idea of the data that is available from X3. Now, you may already have a customer ID that you want to use, but if you don't, this is a nice, easy way of getting back some sample data and then simply taking any one of these pieces of data and using them as the example to get back the test record. And it's important to get back this test record, as you'll see why in a moment. So we're going to take an example here called A10. A10 is the customer unique ID. So instead of having asterisks, I'm going to do A10. Now what you noticed a moment ago was that we've got a couple of columns back. If we're specific about the unique ID for this record, it now can do something a lot more involved. With a unique ID, pass through to the X3 web service method, it can actually take the full web service definition, run it through a unique record, and come back with a complete and utter schema for everything that's possible from that schema, not just the particular columns that it may have as a listing, but now it has every column that's possible to work with. So now that we have every column, it also includes hierarchical data, and that's denoted by sub-record here, which in this case is all of the addresses that make up an account. And also we have things like email and phone numbers, and we'll know what these are ourselves over time. And ultimately that's a large object with a lot of different possible pieces of data. Now, the first thing you can do is, once you've got back that connection, is you simply reaffirm the connection or recreate the table that this connection will make as a virtual entity in CRM. And that's something that you can do. It's part of the steps that you should take, is that you should run the service, make sure that you're getting back the correct data with the new test parameter that you're using, and then simply confirm create table. I've already done this on the system, but once you've hit this button, it will create a new virtual entity, create all of the metadata around this, and reaffirm this as an entity within CRM. And to point that out correctly, if we go to customization and we go to our secondary entities, we should see in here a WS customer entity. And what we now have is a virtual entity with every area and every piece of schema data that makes up the complete and other account. Quite a lot of data on the account specifically. But not just that, it also gives you translations for each of the fields in question. It gives you the correct native field type and the correct size and length of the types. And this would include text, dates, integers, numerics. And if they are deemed as drop-downs from X3, then they also will be created as metadata objects with each of the values that X3 determines. So that single click, it does quite a lot. It establishes a brand new entity, virtual. Don't worry, there's no data being moving here. This is a metadata creation, and allows CRM to understand everything about that entity at that point. But we also pre-package, once you hit that button, you will then be exposing and seeing a series of screen objects and list objects that are pre-packaged with the connector. So we now have an X3 custom screen, and it has already a whole series of fields and screens being configured, which includes various behaviors of fields and things that you would expect them to do and want them to do. And these are all obviously then configurable. And here is the full set of all of the fields that you may want to add to the object and change in the object. And the exact same idea with the list objects is that you may have things like customer listings, and these have links to various next parts of your configuration, which is all standard in CRM in terms of the behavior, what it does. So each of these entities that are available in the prepackaged option are all waiting for you to click through, specify with the correct parameter, and create and reaffirm the entity. And once you've done that, you have your full functionality ready to go. So here is our order example, which will create a WS order entity. We have my unique ID here. Again, you could run the equal star option if you want to get back examples. But if not, if you have that unique ID already, you get back all of the data, exactly the same thing, and you recreate the table, and away you go, you have that. What's very important to see here is that you can obviously extend and change these objects. So I could create a new object in here, and all I will need to do is make sure I call X3, and then call it whatever you're calling the new web service definition in X3. So this could be a WS supplier example. And in X3, we need to go to the actual BPS object, create a WS supplier pointing to the BPS, and then we will create a new WS supplier entity in CRM, get back all its parameters, and then save that as an entity. And that's entirely the exact same thing as we've done as the prepackaged. So you're only really moving on to extend it in the way that you see fit for your entity. Okay, so on the assumption that we've done so far, let's recap, is we've installed the product, we've set up our web.config to have the various values that it needs as the setup. We've affirmed that we have the correct web service URL for X3, and we have then set up the actual objects in X3 itself, these 7 objects prepackaged. And now that we've reaffirmed each of those in here by connecting and resaving, we now have all these entities available. So we finally have gotten to a milestone, which is that you're ready to start talking about functionality and to see what is actually happening. Okay, let me just check for any questions so far. Point here is they followed the installation guide, and I still can't see the standard connections on the WS connection. That's an interesting one. You should, as part of installing, you should by default absolutely see these connections available through the standard. These are ready to go. Obviously, they will fail if you don't have the X3 web service set up on X3 client. It'll just say web service object not available. But you should have these connections out. If you don't, that's a support issue that we're more than happy to sort out. And you can by all means contact us and Sage Opera as well, and we can find out what the issue is. But it certainly should, and it does normally when the normal condition. Okay, so one of the things we need to be aware of as well is that as part of the fact that we have set up the connection and we now have each of the objects done, you're still left with a scenario most likely where you have an empty Sage CRM database and you have an X3 database of customer accounts. So you can now go to the X3 account migration tab and you can begin the first steps of real functional data. So you want to actually get this data back into from X3 and come down into CRM as new companies and persons and phone and addresses and emails, all of type customer, so that you're migrating the first migration of data into CRM. So while this is running as an example, the very first question that normally comes up is, what can I do about configuring what happens in this migration? And this leads us to another area which is very important to be aware of, is that under the project files, under the framework folder, you will have an X3 folder. And this folder is the basis by which all of the X3 functionality that you see is available. And most of this is open source, which means you can look at this, understand the programming around it, and change it accordingly. And point in case, an example is that there's a field mapping, this is all documented, field mappings file. And if you open that up, you will see that it is a function that allows you to decide on the mapping. Now this is pre-packed the way it is. But what you'll notice is, as part of this function, it then maps X3 fields to company fields, person fields, address, phone, and email. And this is the standard out-of-the-box behavior of what the mapping should do. Now again, you will need to know your X3 fields and have some X3 data knowledge about what each of these things do. You can leave it exactly the way it is, of course, if you so choose, or this is where you would start to change things around accordingly. You'll see that there is a flag which is available within the system, which is called X3 is now. This is already pre-packed for you. And what this is a predetermined flag that returns based on the various timestamps that come from CRM and X3. It will be able to predetermine which one should be paid as the master. So whichever system has updated its data last is the master between the two syncs. So this is a bidirectional sync. So when X3 is master is true, it will automatically assume to copy the X3 fields into the CRM fields. If the X3 is master, and this is for each individual record, if X3 is master is false, then it will assume that each CRM field should be copied into the X3 field. So here's a perfect example of how you can start configuring things in a different way. This is a two-way sync, and some people have said, well, what if we want to do a one-way sync? Well, you can now start doing things like that, where you can say, well, I'm going to affect this flag, and I'm going to hard code this flag to be true. And if I do so, it ignores the pre-configured switch and allows you to say, well, you know what? Everything that comes down from X3 is going to update CRM. So now X3 is the master, and CRM will always take the updates from there. However, it's possible that once you've got the initial migration in place, you want to make CRM the master. So by saying X3 is master is equal to false, we'll make sure that every CRM field will update the corresponding X3 field. It may be that there are certain hard-coded values you want to get in place. Like on every sync, we make sure that we copy the credit level from the X3 data down into a local company field that we have pre-configured and now have a local cached version of that credit level. You may want to extend that with lots of new fields in here to your own doing, whatever they may be. So this new field, whatever it might be, comes from some new field or a different field from X3, each of which, once that's in place, is now going to be a new value cached into CRM. Or in this example, all customers are always seen as customers, or sorry, all companies in CRM are seen as customers. There are types of things you may want to change in the field mapping, or you may not want to change these things at all. So this is all happening during the actual migration or synchronization of the data. You do have log files for each of these areas, and this is in the logs folder of the X3. And this will show you in the migration log from here everything that may have occurred at any given time in terms of that sync. So we can see where they found existing ones, where it needs to skip because no updates are required, or when updates are required, we will actually make sure to update correctly. So you can follow this log file available in the folder as well. So let's assume that we've done all our full synchronization. Then we should have a series of data within CRM. So if we go to our companies within CRM, we should now have a full populated series of data. And what we should have in here is that for each one of these, they will have an X3 account number, which is now the link between CRM and X3. Then we'll have a credit level also that's available. And it now has a new X3 tab, which has an example series of functionalities, which we're now going to get into. So let's recap. We did our installation, we did our integration, we set up our connections, and now we ran a full account migration. Now, before we move into the functionality, another question that's often asked is, can this run on a scheduled basis? And of course, the answer is yes. There is, in the X3 folder, there is an option to set up a service which can run on a scheduled service. And this is called call service. And all you simply do is you set up the name of the CRM install name in here. It's well documented. And once you've done that, on the assumption you don't need to change any logic, it will run the synchronization service for you. How you set that up, again, is in the user guide, just so you're aware. This is, again, all the stuff we've just done, about setting up the service, setting up the connections, everything's well documented. Here's about the account migration and synchronization. And we also can see in here further down about the idea of where you want to set up the scheduled accounts install. So this explains, again, what I just showed you, which is setting up the install. And more importantly is it uses standard Windows task scheduling to do this. So you run the basic task which is available in Windows as a task scheduler, and then that means you can decide how often it occurs, at what time, how often, right down to the last minute. And once it's established that it's running that call service, then you can let that run on its own accord. And as that is running, it will create new logs, and you can check what those logs have and so on. The account migration service is here, and you don't have to, but if you so choose, you can change what this logic does. Again, it's a little bit more advanced, but it is all available. And one of the questions that did come up is, what if I only want to synchronize a certain subset of X3 accounts? Well, that's available here because we have a find record which finds all X3 customers. But you can actually use a where clause in here, and it can be a variety of things, and this will be more familiar for X3 configurators in terms of what it can be. But it can be similar to BP num. You can use various key fields like BP num. Just as a silly example, that would say, give me all X3 accounts which have a account number beginning with B. You can do that kind of thing. You can create comma and pass in extra parameters as well. That's a X3 configuration specific area that we can help you with, but it's generally the type of clauses that you would be able to do through the web service. So you can run a scheduled job on the account migration to get you to the point of having a series of data within CRM. Here's an example, a good example we've synced already, which is our London Bicycle Club. And when you look at this, you'll see it has its account number. It has a credit level, which is the cached example of a field value that you may want to keep without needing to look it up in X3. We also have our X3 tab here. Now, this is the functional area that is pre-packaged with CRM. Everything we're going to show you is available out of the box as it stands, but importantly, it is really an example of how to set things up, and you can, of course, disseminate all this functionality and break it up into various tabs, into its own areas. This was kept as a nice way of keeping it all together in one place. And in fact, the whole thing is run by a very simple ASP page, which we've set up that is reusable and hopefully illustrates a lot of what you can do within the system. And we'll explain a bit of coding in a moment as we go through the system. But let's just show you what it does first. You have these options available out of the box, and these are now illustrating the usage of these 7 web service objects, you might say, so that now we have an example which is calling in real time data from X3, bringing it down and converting it, and running things like list objects and screen objects to illustrate that data. If you can see, this is a list object, and that is actually pre-configured in the metadata. And if you want to change the columns that are available in here, or you want to change the order of them, you can. As we click through, we're now onto a screen object and a list object. And again, these are metadata objects that are available within CRM also. But this list object actually has some new behavior that we have brought into play on CRM. As traditionally, list objects were read-only. We've created editable grid objects, and this becomes very useful, especially conducive with X3, because X3, what we have on this page all comes down to CRM as a single hierarchical record. And that suits our needs because as we illustrate in here, let's say, for example, we want to change our credit to 400, change your minimum order to 200. We have things like classes in here. These are all metadata driven that we got from creating the physical entity. We also can change things around in here. So we won't get rid of Linda, she's good. We'll get rid of new person and add in a brand new in here person as well. And that's important to illustrate that you now getting behaviors, editable grids with dynamic data, and you have a way of accessing this data and changing it on the fly all in one go. That's quite important. This editable grid allows access to all of your line items in one go so that you can manage them, edit them, and then save it all in one function back to X3. And while it's setting that up, the whole point of this is that this data does not sit in the CRM database, even though it looks like it's sitting on the database in here. And this data is coming from the data. It's actually coming through the schema of what we've just discussed, which is it's going to X3, running the web service to get back that data, illustrating it within the, or converting it into temporary record-like objects, which these interfaces can then render. So that we literally have full read-write data, and we can change what each of these things do. So if we go a little bit further with the data, and we start looking at, say, quotes within the system, we still are doing the exact same thing. We've got a list object. We can paginate through these objects and see what data is available within the overall listing. And this is all live from X3. If we click through to these things, we can then see, again, the same illustration, but a little bit more functionality again. Let's take the example that we want to add an extra line item within this system. So let's go to item 6. And we can look up in real time all of the products that come available within CRM, or within X3, should I say. But instead of, there may be too many, I may want to actually use some pre-filter objects. So I put in my filter criteria and I get back what I need from the item code that match. So I'm going to use one of those guys, take a couple of them, I'm going to put in my most gross prices, and I may want to delete some data as well. But let's keep that as a basis and actually want to illustrate some values in here. Is as part of saving this, don't forget the whole idea of totaling and validation. So we have 214,200 euro in this case, which is now gone up to 214,600 because of the fact that we got from within here an extra 400, which was pre-calculated by X3. We did not do those calculations, X3 did. And we expect that to be the case, that in all these cases it actually can manage the calculations, the product lookups, etc. Okay, other areas to be aware of is how the validation works. So in standard, again, you can make this required or not. And standard CRM behaviors make sure it points out what is and is not required. So let's plug in these new values and make sure that we are conformant within them. And also we'll check things like validation within the values that come into the data as well. So we've put in new facts of the item, but now it says an invalid number. So it has all that validation that you expect to get within the system coming and going from CRM and X3. And that's quite important to see how these things work. So now that we've put in the right data, it's been accepted. Let's go a little bit further with this. And let's say that when we are looking at a brand new order, let's take it from scratch. So we're going to new order, we put in our item, we look up any series of products, we're just going to take one of those guys, like 5 of those, 20 of them, and you'll see there's defaults of dates and defaults of drop-downs. And that literally within that space of time, by having this screen object and this list object available, using the editable grid object and being able to do product lookups and having those validation requirements built in, we've just created an order on the fly. And as we said at the very start of the session, imagine doing that on tablet, and you now have rapid order entry into X3 from CRM, which is quite important. So let's have a look again at what some of those points were. For example, when we know that we are putting in the order, we can see that when we put in a new order, it does have required fields and defaults. Now, I want to really just make sure that everybody gets this point. This is quite important. Is that if we go to our WS order information, so in other words, our entity, we will look at the pre-configured objects that are available in the system. And one of those items is the order item list, which is what we're using on the interface we saw a moment ago. And when we look at that data, we will see again these columns that we put in place for each line item. When you look at them, you'll see that we have a create script. Now that create script is available on standard CRM, but what it wasn't available in standard was to be able to use some pre-coded variables that you normally can use in screens. We have now made them available to lists because they're editable. So now, but we can make things required by using the standard notation of required equals true in this case. And the product lookup, how does that behave? Well, we make that required also, but we're using standard notation to change the text field into what we call a search selected advanced. And again, this is using standard notation, changing the entry type, and getting it to look up our WS items. And that's as much as it needs to now automatically become a lookup field. Again, order quantity required, line and tax. This is not something that we want to a user to edit. This is a calculated thing by X3, so we just make it read only. Or in our dates, we want to make them required, and we want to give them a default value. So we know X3 requires a certain notation, so we use standard default value notation here, getting back a new date, giving it a certain format, and that is as much as this needs to have those default values. So if you remember those line items, we had required fields, we had read-only fields, we had lookup fields, and we had defaults. Each of the things you're seeing in here in the metadata is exactly what we were illustrating as part of creating a new order. So I just want to make sure people see that we are using standard CRM administration, field level scripts, and these type of things to be able to create the behaviors that you so choose. So as part of these line items in here, with 13 altogether, is that you can create the behavior of what you want to happen and change the behavior of what happens within these things. Okay, one other area that's important to point out is there's two levels of validation. One area of validation we've already shown, which is the idea that when you are creating these data points, it has normal CRM screen validation. So yeah, I have a required field, so I'm going to put in line 14, I'm going to put in my 23. But we also have the notion of next level X3 validation. So I'm going to plug in a bad product code. I'm not going to look it up, I'm just going to try and assume I know the right product code. So even though we have CRM validation, it still will never be able to bypass the X3 validation that comes with the system. And that's something that X3 will report back to us and will tell us what is going on. And in this case, it says non-existent sales product. So you'll never be in a position that you can actually do anything which will violate the data requirements. If we take simple examples, say, of wanting to edit and change an order that's already there, 16, we save that off. Again, you would say that CRM says, well, there's nothing wrong with that, but X3 says that the order is closed. So again, you can work that logic through, you can use that to your own avail, and you can make those things available in each and every case as you go. So how does all this data come together? Well, as I say, we made it available as an open source script, and if we take it bit by bit, let's take the first backdrop as a series of menu items. Well, those menu items are purely done by a series of objects we made available in here. Our customer, quotes, orders, and work orders. And if you wanted to create a new menu item, you simply create a new menu choice. You specify titles, most importantly, what entity you're using and what X3 web service you're using. Then the list objects and screen objects you want to use, again, standard CRM stuff. Some unique IDs to say, okay, well, this customer uses this unique ID for X3 and CRM. And this is the customer contact list. And finally, what image do I want to use? And all of these settings in here make up the basis of these menu objects. So if you do not want to completely reinvent coding for yourself, you could use this code and extend it and change it accordingly. Once you click into something like an X3 order, let's take that example, what we're getting back is a list of orders. That is very simple and straightforward in that it is a display list object. And all this simply does is it actually does a find record on the table name, which in this case was passed in as the X3 order, X3 WS order. And once it's done a find order, you can do things like sorting. You do a get block. And that get block will be the list object. And then you just run a container and execute. And anyone who's familiar with CRM will see this and say, yeah, this is pretty much standard CRM coding. There's nothing in here which is X3 specific about XML, web services, and objects. It's pretty much a standard CRM option with find records, get blocks, and executes. And this piece of code here is what generates these list objects to start the ball rolling. If I click into, and again, this is just a sample that we make available, you now have a screen and a list. And if we look at what that's about, that's a display record. And very, very similar. We do a find record for the basic record that we need to use, the order. We do a get block for the screen. And then what we want to do is find a get block for the list of line items. So now we've got two blocks, both of which are added to container, and then we execute the container. And again, very, very similar. There's a little bit extra in here, which is about a new feature that allows hierarchy of data to be available, and we get access to it by the ADO record. It's well documented, and that's how we get the sub-item list. But literally, with that piece of code in here, you are getting the full functionality of that screen, and everything else is managed by itself. The scrolling, the pagination, the read-write, the change and save, all of these things are part and parcel of what we package as part of the library. So if you want to then move it into change mode, there is no code changes in here. All of that is built into the standard way of doing EWR modes, are called, or CRM modes. And that, in other words, is handling the read-write for you. So it is very, very powerful in terms of the piece of coding you need to do versus the amount of functionality you get back from. Okay, let me just check the chat line and see if we have any comments in it so far. No, we're all good. Just make sure you can give me a hello from people in general that you're still following along as we go. Well, I'm going to get to another point which is quite important now, which is the support level and how to support issues within the actual system. So we need to do a couple of things which will break the system, so you get a feeling for how to manage things as they go. One of the first things I would say is, in our experience in the last few months, is that this integration we're showing you is pretty robust and will run very quickly with your X3 system in terms of connectivity. However, the data is the issue that you need to be very aware of on X3. The demo data can often not be ready for quotes and orders. And what we would always say is that we need to be aware of how to reproduce problems that you may have with the system. And largely, they're not to do with the integration, they're to do with X3. They're to do with the configuration of X3 or to do with some area or problem that the system may have. So an example of how you can set things up is that there is firstly a log folder, not the X3 specific folder in here, but the gateway folder. So that's when something fails coming back from X3 to the gateway. And that you can get from these back to the Enbu gateway, and there is a log folders in here. Now you need to make sure that you turn on logging to its highest level when you have issues. So you will be able to do that in the web document. And there's an area up here called logging level here. 2 is the average, but you can actually set this to be 3 or even 4, I think is the latest, some extra technical coding. But 3 is certainly a level that will allow you to get a lot more info in those log files. What will come out of those log files is that if you have an issue, then within the log folder within the system, let's point this out, let's just turn this on, is that I've set that log file to 3. And if I go back to my areas here, and I'm going to say run an order, and within a order in here, we're going to make a change. So let's just say that I want to add a new item, add in a new line item, and we'll put that in here, and we will save that off. Now, if you have an issue, you will get errors on the red line here, which give you indication of what the issue is, which you saw earlier on. And if they're simple validation areas, then that's obvious in terms of the screens, but you will often get some X3 messages, which you need to interpret and understand what's happened. So in that particular case, what you need to do is be able to make sure to turn on the logging so that you can get back the correct series of data. So one of the areas that's very important is once the logging is set, is the message of the XML that has been sent to the system. So in this case, we were calling an X3 service, which was to modify or update the order using this particular criteria, using this parameter data. Now, this is quite important, and it is a technical point, but it is a tech support issue that you should be aware of, and it will really help to be able to illustrate how to reproduce these errors. So if I take this param data, I'm going to stop from param to param. That's the tag data that X3 expects. This is when your web service tester really comes into play, because you now can reproduce any X3 call from the framework connector to X3 using this system. By going to the Webservice Tester and setting on the context, you can go to the object. In this case, we can set the object to be WS order. We can then plug in parameters, which is all of the param data in here. And we need to double check and see, well, what were we trying to do? Well, in this case, we were going to do a modify, and we had a parameter in here. And we can take the second value of that parameter, and we can actually plug that in as part of the piece. So what I'm doing in here is replicating or reproducing what CRM just did a moment ago, which was to update an order based on this key value with this param data. And if I do a modify, that modify button is now doing exactly what our CRM system is also doing. So this is a great debug utility to understand whether the system is working correctly. Now in this particular case, we saw that everything ran fine. It did not come back with any error messages. The trace is fine. There's a warning message there, which is to do with the screen messages that sometimes come through, but the API can ignore them. That's something you would get normally if you're an X3 client, but you don't need to have these scenarios then in the API. But you can see it's come back and it has no particular problem. Now, if we were to change this around, and if there was a problem that actually occurred within the system, and the best thing I can do is probably plug something in like that, and you can see that there was bad info. And this is something that you can get. It's a little bit innocuous from X3, but that error message can permit itself up to CRM, and this is when this becomes really useful, because we've reproduced the error that you saw in CRM, and we've taken the parameter, theoretically, pasted it in here, and tried to run the same option, and we reproduce the error. So now we can say, this is not an integration issue, it's to do with the XML that was generated. So we can now get into things like replies and data process logs. And we can see in here that the field rev or num is not found. And that gives us the idea of what the problem is. Now, I have fabricated that error, obviously, so the chances of getting that particular error is not very likely, but it gives you the right explanation as to what is going on for further diagnosis. Now, in the latest edition, which we think have made it, if not, they will be available by the end of this week, is that if you turn this on to version logging level up 4, you will also receive back down to Sage CRM that level of data. You will get all of this data also, which is quite exhaustive. It's quite a lot of data, which is why you have to turn it on explicitly. But it will really, really help a huge amount to understand what the issue is. So turning it on to level 4 is very, very useful. So this is for when you're getting into areas which are X3 specific. It could be that it's come back with an X3. We have one at the moment we're working on that we're working with the X3 from the big guys to find out. And it's largely to do with probably a rule in the X3 client or a configuration that they have changed, so that something needs to change about the data that has been allowed to be passed on. And that's very, very important. This tool is hugely valuable, and as part of our own tech support and as part of Sage tech support, this is what we would end up doing anyway. So you guys being aware of that would be hugely important. Okay, one last area that I think is useful to point out is if we go to the opposite area of places or CRM companies that we would like to take from here, but do not reside in X3 yet. So this is the opposite side, which is that we have CRM companies that we would like to populate into CRM. This is one last function we have prepackaged, which is post to X3. And the idea here is that, again, through the field mapping, is that we will have company, phone, address, and email, and that we would actually have, in each particular case, an example of what we need. So, in fact, this tells us, as an example, that the contact last name is required. And that's actually something we can find ourselves, because each field value that comes back from this error is we do understand a little bit more about those, because if we go to the WS customer, we will be able to see within the field values here what that field actually means. So we take our contact and we can see, yep, contact is actually the name of the contact. It's called name. So now we can go back in here, go to our info service, and we can see that we do not have good contact data in here. So we will give it something useful. So we call it Smith and John. And we can give it titles, etc., that kind of thing. And if we're happy that we now have some decent data coming from this, then it starts to hang together. So this is, again, validation that we would need to ensure is in place. Let's give this a little bit more data as well to show this. So, again, it's something that you can get into play, run with the system, and understand how these things are posted. So now that's worked, and it says it was posted, and it's been given a new BP number. And in fact, if we go back to the summary, we can see that, yes, it does have a new account number, and it now has an X3 tab. And in fact, we've just generated the new X3 account for this CRM company, and now we can move straight into our whole idea of, yep, that's where it's coming from, X3 now, which was just created. And we can see and even update various values that we want in here as well. So John Smith has come through. Now, where does all that happen? Again, we go back to our framework X3, our post to X3 page is available. And this, again, is open source, so you can do whatever you need to do within it. It basically finds all the pieces of CRM records, creates the record, maps the fields, and saves the changes. There is very little, again, to worry about here. The most important thing is, again, the data. And this map function is very important. We've tried to build in the relationships of what each of these company fields will do in each of these cases of posting. And there's a whole series of regionalization areas, and we really do need to look at this, because these are the types of things that will not work on a different X3 system based around regions, tax rules, payment terms, and these are the things we should get to know and understand what to set accordingly. We're working on an account, as I said earlier on, that's exactly in this area, where we need to get an X3, the X3 configurator that works with the system and understand what it is that is missing, for example. Again, there's a whole series of flags in here. Each one of these we can find out more on. If you're not familiar with these field names, you can simply take one of these field names. It's actually the suffix on the end that's important. And you can go to Sage CRM. You can look up the entity in question, and you will get at least some sense of information from that in terms of what it's known to be. And in this case, we can see that we found it to be allow, order, close, and it takes the values of yes and no, which takes the values of 1 and 2. And yet that looks to me to be about right, because yes and no are 1 and 2, and we've set that field with the correct value we believe it to be. But it's possible the configuration in an X3 system says it must have this be set to yes for various logical reasons, and that's where you would change these things. Okay, so hopefully that gives a good overview of the various areas. Let's just recap again where we left off. We had got to the stage where we had now got functionality running. We saw that we have a whole series of interfaces in here which can be extended and changed and customized. They are all available through our open source. It explained the fact that everything does run against metadata. So each of these objects use and are governed by the objects that we prepackage, and also you can use your own objects in there. And those objects are mounted to screens and lists, and they all have their validation requirements in there, so that a lot of the work can be done through configuration of metadata, which is what you want it to do. And then we also looked at the fact that while you run those things, you also have the opposite, which is CRM populating X3, and that has a post option, which again has its own open source, which again can be changed according to what values you want. Okay, let me stop for a moment and just check if there's any questions so far. We've kind of gotten to a point now which is covering most of the areas. The issue you have now is really to get stuck into the product, see what potential it has, and the opportunities are pretty high on this in terms of what you can get it to do. But you really do need to sort of get to grips with the overall idea, with the web services concept. And what I'd say is, once you have a CRM person in place, they will be able to do a lot very quickly. But you do need to have information on the X3 side, the X3 configuration, the X3 fields. Not an X3 developer, but an X3 configuration person that at least can deal with the issues as they come up on the X3 side. The integration itself is pretty robust and it runs accordingly, and most issues are just down to what it needs to understand and address on the X3 side as they go. Okay, let me just open up audios, and let's just see if there's any audio feedback as well on what people have seen, and if you could let us know any areas that we didn't cover today that you would like me to continue and show more on. So any feedback out there? Hey Ernie, you're normally good for a bit of feedback. How's that look so far for you?
Looking good on this side. Great.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm going to stop the recording at this point so that we at least have it finished in the right capacity, and then you can leave things open for further questions. Geez.